This is the Palin Update on Mama Grizzly Radio. I'm Kevin Scholla.
The beliefs of that grassroots movement is just so fundamentally common sense, planks in the Republican platform, that it baffles me that the machine would continue to push back on it.
The GOP establishment does often sound ridiculous, bashing the strongest members of the party and so many independents that believe in upholding our Constitution. Some have even gone as far as to call our top Tea Party leaders wacko birds. Today, we're joined by Joel Pollak, editor-in-chief at Breitbart.com and the author of the new book, Wacko Birds, The Fall and Rise of the Tea Party. Sarah Palin hits the campaign trail for Rob Maness in Louisiana. A brand new Commonwealth Common Sense with Susan Stimson is coming up from Virginia. And just ahead, our latest edition of Steel Resolve with Sarah Steelman of Missouri. Right now, we say hello to Joel Pollak. He is the editor-in-chief at Breitbart, and his new book, Wacko Birds, The Fall and Rise of the Tea Party, is making plenty of noise everywhere. Hi, Joel. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it. And the new book is out, Wacko Birds, The Fall and Rise of the Tea Party. And let's start right there with the title of it. I know pretty much where you got that Wacko Birds term from. Can you tell our listeners what that means?
Well, Wacko Birds was the term that Senator John McCain used to disparage the Tea Party after Rand Paul pulled a half-day filibuster, the old-style talking filibuster, against Obama's drone policy. And the name stuck partly because it was embraced by Tea Party leaders like Ted Cruz, who said, okay, well, if that's wacko, if standing up for the Constitution is wacko, then we don't embrace that label. And so the Tea Party kind of warmed up to the idea of being the Wacko Birds. Instead of it being a pejorative, it just became kind of a banner. And that's where I got the title for the book from. You can look at it either way. If you're a critic of the Tea Party, you probably still think they're Wacko Birds. If you're a fan of the Tea Party, you don't mind it at all.
It's something, though, isn't it, that term comes from within the Republican Party? Not that the Tea Party is Republican. It certainly isn't. It's independent, and it's folks who stand up for the Constitution and, taxed enough already where the original name came from. But here you have a guy, McCain, and many others in that party establishment who just don't want to share the stage with the Ted Cruzes or the Rand Pauls of the world. So where does the Tea Party stand when you look at it from that angle?
Well, it's in a difficult position at the moment because, on the one hand, it's managed to knock off a couple of really powerful figures in the last few months, like Eric Cantor in Virginia, and it's also been able to stop some of the agenda items of the Obama administration, like cap and trade, like amnesty, and so forth. On the other hand, it's really been largely defeated, I think, in some of these Senate primaries, House primaries across the nation. There aren't too many Tea Party champions on the ballot this November in the general election. So it's really faced a tough pushback from the establishment, and it's kind of looking for answers as to what its next step is really going to be. One of the things I talk about in Wacko Birds is the struggle the Tea Party has faced to define its leaders. And while many Tea Party people will tell you that one of the strengths of the movement is it doesn't have a centralized leader, doesn't have a centralized organization. In certain circumstances, that becomes a weakness because when opportunities arise or they are won by the Tea Party often fails to come through by electing leaders to important posts. Most recently, for example, in trying to figure out who would replace Eric Cantor, the position just went to the next guy in line, Kevin McCarthy of California, rather than a Tea Party or conservative leader. The Tea Party have never had a seat at the table of House Republican leadership, despite the fact that the Tea Party is pretty much solely responsible for the majority that Republicans now enjoy. So it's a frustrating situation, and one I think that tends to weaken a political movement over time. The Tea Party, I think, has a couple more elections in it before it runs out of steam, but I do think that it can change that trajectory by solving some of these leadership problems and really defining and continuing to define, I should say, the nature of debate in the United States, the issues that are going to get voters out to the polls, that are going to concern people. Who would have thought that national security and immigration would be issues here in the fall of 2014? But they are, largely because the Tea Party stood firm on issues like immigration. So it's certainly a question that is very current about the future of the Tea Party. And really, one of the things I say in the book even though I'm critical of some aspects of the Tea Party, I say that America needs a Tea Party to be successful because we have such a weak opposition at the moment. Congress not even wanting, for example, to take up the issue of Obama's war in Syria, which he has no real constitutional authority to do, and yet the Congress just doesn't want to be faced with a tough vote. You have the Tea Party trying to hold the government accountable on that and other issues. So America really does need this opposition. The question is, can it succeed politically soon enough to prevent the complete erosion of the constitutional balance of powers?
Well, you are very honest in the book, and I appreciate that because you do defend the Tea Party, but you also do point out the weaknesses, and I think that people can take a look at that and really get a real sense of where it came from, what's happening now, and how things move forward. Another thing I found very interesting, Joel, and it's something that I thought before, but I think you really point to some basis behind it, is that you contend that most Americans agree with pretty much what Tea Partiers stand for, yet time and time again, we see liberals elected or moderate Republicans elected by those who, if you put on a piece of paper candidate X and Y without a name per se, they would tend to agree with the things that we hear about from Tea Party rallies and Sarah Palin and Ted Cruz. So how does that work out? Are they just not doing their homework, or is it a situation where the most money wins? Why are people agreeing with some of the things Tea Party people say, but then voting for the opposite?
I think you've correctly identified the Tea Party has an image problem, and it has this problem so starkly. When you look, for example, at the issues like Obamacare, 60% of Americans want Obamacare to be repealed. That's the core of the Tea Party agenda, and yet support for the Tea Party is probably less than half of that. So you ask yourself, how does this come about? Well, the reason is really that Democrats and the left have been aided by the media. The media have really had it in for the Tea Party from the beginning. The Tea Party were castigated falsely as racist. That wasn't even the first attack, by the way. At first, they were considered extremist. Even today, you can find media commentators assuming that things the Tea Party stands for are extremist, even though they're supported broadly by the American public. The Tea Party basically has been up against not just hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars, if you include media outlets like HBO, which just gives free airtime to anti-Tea Party perspectives. They've just been up against this just enormous odds. It's a miracle they've lasted as long as they have. The left looks at this and wonders, why are they still here? How come they're not dead yet? You know, the left sees the Tea Party as sort of cockroaches that survived the nuclear holocaust. That analogy has been sort of used before, by the way, by columnists and commentators on the left, I believe. And from the conservative perspective, it's like, well, how come the Tea Party hasn't succeeded yet? You know, we feel the Tea Party has an authentic connection to grassroots voters, is really in touch with the concerns of the American people, so why have they not succeeded? And that's really the question, but it really does come down to media. It comes down to some internal opposition in the Republican Party. But above all, and one of the things I say in Wacko Birds is it comes down to a lack of self-confidence. That this movement is so fresh and so new and so composed of political amateurs and people who really have never done this kind of thing before that they just kind of lack the self-confidence to take the reins of leadership. You know, Obama was exactly the opposite. When you had Obama and his movement, I mean, he knew nothing about governing, had no executive experience, and yet was supremely confident of his own abilities. The Tea Party basically has the opposite issue, and that's something that needs to be resolved.
And when you say self-confidence, could you also put stick-to-itiveness in there? Because, I mean, you think of, say, a Sarah Palin, who has been true blue all the way with where she stands on issues, but she's not in office. Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, there are a few who are elected who you know where they stand. But you mentioned Eric Cantor. There are others as well, McDonald, from a gubernatorial standpoint, who started as Tea Party guys, quote-unquote, and then they were tugged the other way. So isn't that another thing to watch out for? I mean, if you're going to do this, like you said, it's in its infant stage. Is really, you got to stick to it.
Yeah, you've identified one of the major problems, which is basically that there's been this betrayal, you could call it, of the Tea Party by some of the governors and some of the federal representatives who were elected on a Tea Party wave. And McDonald is a prime example. I mean, never mind the corruption. The high taxes to pay for new transportation spending, and especially the attempt to extend Medicare or Medicaid through Obamacare. That was a complete reversal, by the way, of his earlier promise. He promised in July 2012 or thereabouts that he was not going to take the Medicaid money as part of Obamacare after his Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli, had actually filed the first challenge to Obamacare. Then he turned around after the presidential election and tried to get the money into the state for this expanded Medicaid program that Tea Party conservatives really didn't want. They didn't want any part of Obamacare. So that sort of thing does tend to discourage political activists. People you are for and really put yourself on the line for, not just in terms of hours or amount of money you spend, but your credibility with your neighbors, your relatives. If they turn around and betray the principles you've fought for, that's a real downer. And you're going to people start to distance themselves from politics at all if that sort of thing continues. So that's one of the challenges the Tea Party has to work against. You've got to show governing success. Spots is Scott Walker in Wisconsin, who is in a tough re-election fight right now. He's ahead slightly, but he's really that fealty to his principles. The advice they're getting from Washington, D.C. is to stick to the safe route, not to rile up the unions, don't get the left upset. Scott Walker went straight into that wave and met it head on, and it crashed over the deck, and he was still standing. So, that's just a profile in courage, and I think that would happen more often if it just had the strength of their own convictions. Again, I think it can happen. I think it's certainly possible. There have been some missed opportunities, but this election this year and also the 2016 contest both offer a real chance for the Tea Party to get back on its feet.
And you mentioned Walker. I mean, that's not necessarily a conservative state either, because while Walker and Clayfish were able to get through that runoff situation, it was sandwiched by 2 Obama victories.
Yeah, look, Wisconsin went Obama twice, and it obviously elected Walker not just once but twice in the recall election. I think what you see there is a difference in not just the electorate that comes out in Election Day, but the question that voters think they face when they elect a governor versus a president. When they're electing a governor, they're aware that they're electing a person who will directly impact their lives in terms of the policies that person enacts. When they're electing a president, people are not just electing someone who will carry out policies, but they're electing someone who will represent them in his or her character. And so it's almost an identity vote. And I think that's why Obama won these 2 times. People look at Obama, and even with all his flaws and failings, they say, well, I kind of like what he represents about my country. I like the fact that we elected a minority to be president. I like the fact that anyone can make it in America. I like the fact that he at least seems to have a global outlook, although he's alienated so many of our allies. But at least in rhetorical terms, he seems to want to reach out to the world. That's the kind of America I want to be in. So that's why people vote for him. There's people on the fence about some of these things. A lot of Tea Party folks will say, that's just a show. I mean, he's very skillful at his rhetoric and speeches and campaign style attacks and that sort of thing. But I think people vote for Obama as a head of state rather than a head of government. And the governor is really, of any particular state, really is just that, a head of government. And Scott Walker, would not win first prize in a charisma contest. But in terms of his management ability, I think that's the reason he's still in there in an otherwise blue state.